Welcome to the Digometer, where we investigate ways of creating awesome learning experiences and tackle tricky issues in learning design. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Amy Whitehead, the director of Stag Recruitment. Amy is a learning design recruitment specialist, which means she helps businesses find quality learning designers. She works with businesses of all sizes, from startups to edtech giants, and has a wealth of experience of placing candidates in learning-related roles. I invited Amy to join me for a LinkedIn Live discussion to find out what she looks for when recruiting learning designers. And she explains what hiring managers want from learning designers, the differences between university and more corporate learning design roles, the core skills that learning designers need, and why the ability to work with and manage multiple stakeholders is such a core skill. So, without further ado, let's get on with the podcast. So, Amy, welcome to the Digometer Live, LinkedIn Live.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining today. It's really looking forward to talking with you around your views around learning design, recruiting for learning design. I know you've got a lot of experience in this area, and I'm sure people attending the event will be super interested to just get an insight into this world of learning design, what you've been doing, what recruiting learning designers involves, how you might convert to be a learning designer, all these kind of things that we're going to try and get into over the next sort of 45 minutes. So maybe can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and Stag Recruitment? So how are you involved in learning design? What kind of work do you do, and who have you worked for in the past?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's very exciting to be able to share the knowledge I've sort of built up over the years. So yeah, thank you for the platform. And yes, I'm the founder of a little company called Stag Recruitment. We are specialists in digital learning recruitment specifically, largely across the education sector. So that encompasses higher education, further education, as well as K-12, a lot of edtech organisations within that, and that's organically branched out into a lot of apprenticeships providers and alternative routes into careers as well. So it's a growing sector. I recruit everything across the digital learning spectrum. So that's everything from the learning design right through to the physical build, those that look after the platforms that house that learning, and all of the weird and wonderful titles that come in between that, which are endless. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's my specialism. I've worked with lots of universities specifically who are over the years consistently building their e-learning teams, lots of further education colleges, royal colleges and chartered institutes as well is a popular area. As well as working with some really innovative edtech startups and a lot of, most recently, apprenticeships and bootcamp organisations too that are providing sort of alternatives to the traditional routes into careers. So yeah, it's quite a large area that I cover, and it's ever growing, to be honest. I'm sure if you asked me next year, it'd be entirely different.
It's super interesting, and particularly this fact that it is a growing sector. You mentioned this is certainly something that I've noticed, certainly post-COVID, that there is this sort of increased focus on learning design, both in educational context but also in a corporate context. In your experience, why do you think that is? Before we get into sort of how we hire for learning designers, why do you think there is this sort of growth in learning? What's driving that, and driving the growth for learning designers particularly?
I think obviously, year on year as a planet, we are becoming more digital. It's being woven into everything we do in life now. So organically, education has adopted technology more heavily. And I think over the past few years, events, i.e. the pandemic, that has certainly transformed online learning. So I found that since COVID, there's been a lot more remote learning opportunities for people. There's been different routes into education as well. So I think it was always going to progress as an industry anyway, year on year, just like every industry is progressing in terms of technology. But I think COVID has definitely had a significant impact, of course, on everything, but in particular education, because any kind of nervousness that there was or apprehension around incorporating technology or even swapping out technology completely in some areas has been eradicated, because people have almost been forced into doing it that way, seeing that it is an effective way to learn, seeing that in terms of outreach, you can get out to larger learner audiences, you can be more creative with your approach. And I think people have then seen the solution and seen that actually the learner outcomes are much better using this technology. So it's kind of catapulted into this new form of blended learning now that's just part and parcel of everyone's educational experience versus it being a luxury, I guess, a few years ago, if you will.
That's super interesting. Yeah, that point that it's no longer a luxury. I think, like you say, pre-pandemic, it felt like learning design. I mean, I wasn't even really aware of the term. Was a sort of it was a nice to have, but actually it wasn't core. But it does feel, as you say, that sort of post-pandemic, this sort of acceleration of work generally and activity. That there is an increased focus on how we prepare people, how we upskill people, and this seems to be driving some kind of design. Demand for in-house learning design expertise. Yeah. And I know you've worked a lot with hiring managers in all sorts of organizations, like you say, apprenticeships, education, but also corporate. Broadly, it's a big question, but I mean, what sort of things are hiring managers asking for when they're hiring learning designers? Because often, I mean, I imagine they don't necessarily know a lot about learning. So how do they know what they're asking for? How do you field that question when they say we need a learning designer? What's your initial response to that?
Yeah, it's interesting actually what you said there about how much they know about learning. So that dictates what kind of learning designer they will ask for. Quite often the hiring managers I'm working with are people who are heading up online learning teams. So naturally they do know a lot. They've probably come from learning design themselves. And that's when you get a bit more of a specific type of candidate that they're after, because they know exactly what they need for that role. There are some instances where hiring managers might be quite far removed from a learning design team. It might be an overarching director that isn't from that kind of background, that probably struggles to know what they really need from a learning designer. But if we sort of answer that question from the perspective of a hiring manager who's in learning design themselves, as I know we've discussed this previously, it tends to be more on the soft skill side of things that I'm asked for experience in, as opposed to specific technical skills. There's obviously always going to be a certain basic level of knowledge a learning designer needs to have. The key factors I find most of my clients need are largely around characteristics as opposed to physical technical skills, which I always find quite interesting. And those I've sort of generalized them across 3 different areas. The first one is stakeholder management skills. I've mentioned this a few times in a couple of webinars I've been in recently. It is the key characteristic for any learning designer's success, I find, from experience hiring in this space. In order to have a successful learning design process and have a successful project outcome, you need to have that buy-in, you need to have that relationship with stakeholders. And I think still now, even though there's been a lot of progression in online learning, there's still a nervousness, there's still an apprehension in some areas from stakeholders. And as a learning designer, it's often a case of really having to educate your stakeholders on why what you're doing is necessary, why it's important, letting them see the outcome of your plans, of your design. And again, just getting that buy-in. So being able to build those relationships without rustling feathers is a real skill. And it's not an easy skill to possess. If you imagine some academics that have been in their field for 30 plus years, they've always been in traditional lecture theatres. As a learning technology expert coming in towards perhaps the end of someone's career, it can be a very scary, overwhelming concept. So it's a real skill and a talent to be able to softly introduce the idea and to work with that stakeholder so that you can have a real, I guess, smooth process in the end. So for this to succeed as a role, you have to have that skill. I always sort of pinpoint that as a key criteria. Also, and this is going to sound quite obvious, but you have to be innovative. Education is developing rapidly. What I used to recruit 4 or 5 years ago, or even 1 year ago versus now, there's always change, and it never stops and it never will. That's what makes it so exciting in this sector.
Sure.
But it means as a learning designer, clients are often saying, I want someone that's curious. I want someone that likes to play with new tools and go to the events and learn what's new, what's happening, how can we be ahead of the curve? So, someone who can demonstrate that they've got that experience, that they're really connected to the industry as a whole, and that they're not afraid to play with new things. And then finally, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, I'd say as a learning designer specifically, a learning designer naturally sits in a slightly more senior position than the rest of the digital learning team. Largely, they almost act as the project manager of the team. They're kind of, I hate to say this cliche term, but they are kind of the glue that holds it together. They're the backbone of the process. They're the person responsible for that piece of learning and writing that curriculum. So in order to bring their vision to life, they need to work with a team effectively. They need to manage timescales, even budgets in more commercial settings, and ensure that the outcome is successful, essentially. So those are three kind of pillars that I commonly see when I'm taking briefs from clients.
Right. That's really interesting. And my next question was going to be, which of those are non-negotiable? But it sounds like pretty much all those are non-negotiable, would you say? I mean, are they all integral? If someone comes forward for a learning design role, do you look for their experience of stakeholder management, sort of curiosity and project management as a default?
I would say that I'm always gunning for those characteristics to be ticked off. I'd say stakeholder management is probably an essential, because most people in interview would struggle if they don't convince a hiring manager that they've got that ability, because that's often what they're struggling with in their team and where the gap is in their team, and that they need this learning designer to come along and do. I'd say innovation, again, if someone's not innovative, it's highly unlikely that a hiring manager is going to pick them amongst someone who is demonstrating that.
Yeah.
But I'd say the project management side is something that you could, there's wiggle room on that, because quite often hiring managers are interested in taking people who want to develop into that. So it might be that they are more of a junior level learning designer, where they've perhaps sat amongst the team and there's been a senior designer who does all of that. Right. And they sort of dip into the projects. So that's one that is not necessarily a must-have. It's a popular requirement, but there's also an option for someone on the more junior or entry-level end to learn that as they go.
And in terms of, I mean, you've mentioned around the technology and the skills, and perhaps there is, I'm going to say, less demand for technology, because you've obviously mentioned innovation and exploring new tools. But my question is, what does the blend of technical and soft skills look like? I mean, I'm not necessarily asking you to put a percentage on it, but I mean, there is as you know, more than anyone, I imagine, this sort of two groups. There's instructional designers and learning designers, and I can see that there's a huge amount of overlap, but there are distinct differences. And people talk to me often about the ADDIE framework and using e-learning authoring tools, which aren't necessarily my skill set either, but I'm still a learning designer. So, I mean, is it expected that you can just do that and that learning design is extra on top of those skills? Or if someone hasn't built e-learning content, can they still be put forward for a learning design role, if you see what I mean?
So that's a really challenging question, mainly because it's just it can be quite dramatically different depending on the organisation. And I know I've spoken in the network about this before. What's required of a learning designer in terms of technical skills depends on the team and the organisation as a whole. So, for instance, if you're going into a learning design team where you've got a team of, let's call them e-learning developers, people responsible for the physical build. Normally, as a learning designer in that team, you would get to focus on the pedagogical side, the curriculum design, and then pass that on to the builders. So you almost don't need any authoring tools for some roles I recruit for. I'm working with a university at the moment who it's just strictly the instructional design process. It's called a learning design role, but they're not actually getting involved with any of the technology. It's all managed by the tech and the builders. However, there are also organisations such as perhaps small edtech startups where you are what I term sort of an ID/developer, where you're an end-to-end, you do everything from concept to design to physical build. And that's, again, quite a common requirement in some smaller teams. So there's no sort of one answer to that. It's more a case of, it depends on what kind of organization you'd like to be a part of. You know, if you want to go and work for a small startup, you're probably going to have to get yourself clued up on all the technical skills, the rapid authoring tools, be confident with an LMS, with various LMSs, but also able to do the instructional design. If you want to work for instance, a university where there's an established digital learning team, you're probably going to be able to just focus on the pedagogical side. So if you want to set yourself up for success across the piece, then it's always good to have those development skills as well, and be tech savvy, as well as being a designer. Of course, that's just going to open multiple doors, but it's certainly just down to what kind of environment you want to be in, and researching what the expectations are in terms of technical and soft skills within that space.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Amy. And just to say to everyone watching, thanks for comments and questions in the chat. I will endeavour to get to those. Obviously, can't speak and type at the same time, but even after the session closes, I'll do my best to get through all of those questions. So do post and share your questions as you go through, and I'll get to them just as soon as I can. But thank you for your input and your questions. Just to follow on from what you were just saying, Amy, about the different environments, you've mentioned before when we've spoken this sort of difference between higher education focused learning designers and more commercially focused learning designers. What are those differences? Are they quite stark? If you're working in an HE, higher education university context, like how does that differ from a corporate context in terms of the learning designer?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There is quite a big difference from my experience. I'm always careful not to generalize too much, because there are obviously lots of HE institutes that are acting commercially, and likewise commercial organizations that act much like educational establishments. But from experience and sort of generally speaking, there are quite significant differences. For instance, in higher education, your stakeholders are your academics. The type of stakeholder you're working with requires a very different approach in terms of building relationships, in terms of, I guess, just communication in general. The outcome of the learning design process is different. The sort of goals of the organisation differ from more commercial organisations. So you'll find that in HE, it's more focused around, what are the success rates of these learners? What are the engagement levels? How are they engaging with the tools, and using that data to inform, well, how can we create even more success for these learners? Whereas in commercial, it is still that, but then there's also a layer of, what are the commercial outcomes of this course? How much has it allowed us to reach out to a larger audience? How much attraction have we had for new learners? How much did this course cost us, and how can we work on that? What's the profit from this course? So again, very generalized ideas there, but those are quite significant differences. Also, the teams that you're amongst as a learning designer will be very different and will naturally inform your process. So in commercial, I'm just using a few recent examples. For instance, when I supported Multiverse, your team are product managers, marketing, and as a learning designer, naturally, collaborating with that type of team, you're going to have a product orientated approach. Again, drawing into what I said before, what are the commercial goals that we have and how can we meet those? Looking at it much more from a business perspective, as well as creating an amazing piece of learning. In HE, your team are learning technologists and developers. So you're talking about the platform, you're talking about, how can we increase user experience? How can we enhance the student experience? So the conversations and the goals and the mindsets tend to be quite different across the two. And again, there are edtech organizations and startups that kind of sit in between the two, where they can hire from either side. So yeah, as you can see, it's a minefield out there, but hopefully that generalizes it a little bit for people entering into it.
No, that really helps to clarify. You've sort of got higher education universities on one side, very corporate focused on the other side, and like you say, you may have some alternative providers, bootcamp providers in the middle who may be able to draw on both pools of talent. Yeah. Can I ask you about data? Because obviously you've sort of alluded to this in terms of the data that learning designers use. Is that data or a key differentiator in terms of the data that the learning designers have to work with? So in higher education, they might be working, like you say, on data around engagement, satisfaction, whereas in a corporate context, it might be much more about return on investment, that kind of thing. What are the expectations of data literacy, I guess, of learning designers in terms of what data they need to be able to use when they're working?
To be honest, there's still not a huge expectation for learning designers to have a data-orientated mindset or to have significant experience in, being able to translate data to inform the next process. But having worked with some recent sort of high growth startups in edtech, I'm finding that the word data is sort of woven through the learning design process now. So this is more of a skill that I am seeing is going to be more in demand in the future, but is still very much in the infancy stages. So I've worked with a few high growth edtech companies that are wanting people to really plant areas of data capture along the course and use that information to inform the commercial strategic decision, if you will, as well as the learning design strategy. In HE, it tends to focus largely on the learner experience, the student experience, although there still are obviously a lot of commercial goals for HE as well. As a learning designer, you tend to be a bit more removed from that, and it's more about student experience. So how can we capture engagement levels? How can we capture how well these students are performing in these courses? And again, in the commercial sector, it's a case of, how well can we capture this? Because we need to know how to create a bigger profit or to expand or to make it more efficient. So there isn't really a great requirement out there for someone to be a data scientist / learning designer. People don't need to panic and start, learning how to do that. It's more just, someone who's got a basic level or a curiosity in capturing that data to inform your learning design process moving forward. So it's just something I have spotted coming up more that is well worth people keeping in the back pocket to be, I guess, future proof, to call it. It's sort of a simple term.
Yeah, that's great. That's good to know, because as you say, it's hard to imagine the data won't impact learning design and learning design recruitment, but it is useful to get your view on how important that is against other factors, like you say, sort of stakeholder management at the moment. So that's definitely one to bear in mind in terms of something that is a future aspiration. Yeah. My last question really is around advice to people who are perhaps thinking of retraining as learning designers. I know you've mentioned in the past that you're working or you're talking regularly with people trying to move out of or transition from higher education or education roles, it could be the school sector roles, into learning design and learning design related roles because it's a growth area. What advice would you give to people if they think, actually, I've had enough of teaching, or I've had enough of lecturing, or I want to just explore my career options? What are some of the questions that an educator, inverted commas, should ask themselves if they're looking to reposition themselves? Where would they start, and what advice would you give them?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, as an educator, it's the reason why so many people in teaching are interested in this career, and why I spend so much time speaking to educators, is because it's such a great transition into learning design. Because as an educator, you've got that grounding in education, you've got that pedagogical experience. You can design and deliver education. It's just taking what you already know and moving into this sort of technology space. And it's actually there's some quite simple tips and advice, and I'm going to sound like I'm telling you the obvious in some ways, but are well worth following. And you'll find yourself quite quickly getting into this sector. And the first one, obviously, as an educator, if you've had experience of writing the curriculum yourself, like some teachers may not have actually been able to write the the programs themselves. So if you can get some experience in doing that, if you can start stepping into the curriculum design, great, and you want to be plastering that as clear as day in your profile. If you can design a piece of learning, you are most of the way there. And as well as that, I imagine most people in education over the past few years have had to incorporate technology into their learning. So again, just making that clear in your profile, how you have done that, what type of tools, and linked to that, and again, I've mentioned this earlier, showing that curiosity. As a teacher, you can incorporate lots of tools and technologies and methods, and there's lots of new research and approaches out there all of the time. So as a teacher, you want to kind of demonstrate where you've researched and what you've brought into the classroom, what you've brought into your role, just to really show that innovation to potential hiring managers. And if you feel as though you're quite thin on the ground with that, then start now. Get out into the sector, attend the events, play with the trials, download things, tinker, as I like to call it, and you can put that onto your profile. Things like Articulate Storyline offer a completely free 30-day trial. I've done it myself. I'm not a learning designer, and I found it quite simple. So if I can do it, get it on there. Once you've got that base, whack it on your CV. Again, just really simple things, but they will work. Another thing that I thought, having worked with a few high growth companies, what I find that hiring managers in those spaces look for is, what impact have you had in your role, whatever that may be. You may be a teacher, you may be something different, but what impact have you had? What sort of set you aside from the other educators in that organisation? What success did you have? Perhaps you had specific success rates with a certain cohort of learners. Why do you think that was? What were the stats on that? And just demonstrating that in your profile is just going to allow you to be, I guess, a cut above the rest that are looking to get into this space. And finally, network. Get on LinkedIn. It's the most collaborative industry ever. People are so eager to collaborate and get together physically and virtually. There are constant webinars, sessions, podcasts like this, physical events. Get yourself out there, and before you know it, you'll have a fantastic network of people there, and organically job opportunities will come out of that.
That's amazing. I do have one last question, actually, because in addition to all of that, that's super useful advice, and it's great to hear it directly from yourself as a recruiter, what you're looking for. I suppose my final question is a bit more open-ended. Obviously, there's a whole load of debate around AI, ChatGPT, algorithms, all these kind of tools. And I've had some chats with people recently about concerns on the impact on learning design, as there are concerns on impact on other sectors, because if it becomes quicker and easier to automate content, then how's that going to affect learning design? Now, I've got a view on this myself, in that I still think good learning design is currently not automatable. You can automate aspects of the process, but what's your view from a recruitment side about, or how is AI potentially going to change or impact? How will it impact learning design and learning design recruitment, do you think? Are you starting to see an impact at the moment, or not yet?
To be completely honest, I'm not yet seeing an impact. I think it's obviously something that you only have to scroll down LinkedIn for 5 seconds to see content about it, and it's both exciting and nerve-wracking as a tool, isn't it? And I often wonder what will this mean for creative writing and things like that. But I've seen a lot of chatter along the network of, it can be a fantastic tool, if not replacing traditional education. So whether it will be adopted, i.e. whether it will replace learning designers, I really wouldn't feel confident enough to answer that and say. I'm not seeing anything just yet. But I think it's like many tools that we've seen over the years, that we've, how many things have come along that they think we're all going to be replaced. That's it. But I think there's always going to be a need for the human element, and I don't think you'll ever get away from that. And I think the network is the industry of online learning is too strong and too successful to be replaced like that. I firmly believe that we will find a way as a sector to collaborate with that tool and incorporate it and allow it to be blended into the way we do things, but without replacing it. Students or learners are always going to value that human interaction, are always going to value real life feedback and real life mentorship. And I really don't see it affecting learning design jobs, i.e. replacing them. It might just enhance what a learning designer does and how they work with that tool. And I'm sure we'll see over the next year or so what that will look like. And hopefully I'll have a more scientific answer for you in time when we see it roll out a bit further.
That's super useful, Amy. Thank you for your views on that. It's, as I say, early days, but it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over the coming months. Just to say thank you so much for sharing your insights on learning design, recruitment into learning design, and your tips and suggestions for how people might make this move out of more educational focused roles into learning design. I've probably got a ton more questions that I'd like to ask you, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll draw it to a close there. But just to say huge thanks, and thank you to everyone for sharing comments and questions in the chat. And I will endeavour to get through all of those once we've closed the session. So thank you all very much. Amy, good luck with continued recruitment at Red Stag, and very much excited to check in with you in a few months to see how things are changing in the world of learning design recruitment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.